Climb or Die by Edward Myers. Danielle was bashing at the rock with Dad's hammer. With each blow, chips of icy snow flew like sparks. Some of the chips sprayed toward Jake. A few even struck his face. He held out his hand, motioning for her to stop. Before he could speak, however, something caught his attention. Danielle wasn't bashing at the rock just to let off her frustration. She was experimenting. She was trying to figure something out. The hammer came down once, twice, 3 times. Chips flew outward. Then, without saying a word, Danielle turned the hammer around. She continued to grip its metal shaft by the rubber-clad handle, but now she struck at the icy granite with the claw, not with the head. The claw was the side you used for pulling nails out, a curved, pointed piece of forged steel. "What are you doing?" Jake asked. Danielle replied, "Improvising." Jake watched in puzzlement. Then suddenly he understood. "An ice axe?" "You got it, Danielle." Danielle struck the slab several times with the hammer's claw. Instead of scattering lots of chips, it sent fewer of them outward and mostly sideways. Otherwise, the metal dug deep into the crust. "The claw cuts in much more steeply than a regular ice axe would," she told Jake. "It's more like what climbers use for what they call vertical ice. It's not very sharp." She pulled the hammer back with her right hand, then stroked the claw with the fingers of her right. "But like you said, beggars can't be choosers." Jake felt a surge of hope and delight. "You think it'll work?" "There's only one way to find out." She reached out to Jake. "Here," she said. "I'll need your hammer too." He handed it over at once. The hammers worked, Danielle told herself, just as the screwdrivers functioned as crude pitons and the loops of nylon leash served as crude carabiners. The hammers worked well as crude ice axes. She couldn't quite believe it, but they worked just fine. Something else she couldn't believe. Danielle herself had thought it up half the system. Not Jake. Danielle. Even though Jake suggested the general idea of improvising hardware, Danielle was the one who figured out most of the specifics. First the fake carabiners, now the fake ice axes, and the system worked. No wonder Jake got such a kick out of doing this, she told herself. It wasn't just coming up with a new idea, it was getting in a jam, then finding a way out. It was a great feeling, a feeling much like what she'd felt at Mountain Mastery when, stuck high on a cliff, Danielle had taken a chance, pulled herself out of danger, and discovered strength she hadn't even known she had. Somehow, he'd done it, Jake thought. He'd fallen, yet he'd pulled himself up. He'd kept going. He'd overcome the pain, the fear, the doubt that he could continue. Despite dropping 2 or 3 feet and slamming into the cliff, despite banging his shoulder and his face, he hadn't given up. Here he was now, heading up all over again. For the first time, Jake started to understand why Danielle liked sports so much, not because of winning, coming out ahead of everyone else, instead because of coming out ahead of himself. He glanced at his watch. 33. Now the biggest challenge rose right before them. "Belay on?" Daniel called down to Jake. "On belay," he shouted back. "Climbing. Climb." Climbing that icy trench was the hardest work Danielle had ever done. With a hammer in each hand, she struck out with the right one till it caught securely, then flexed her biceps to pull her body upward while she kicked at the slab with her boots, struggling to find some kind of foothold. Then she struck out with the left hammer and, kicking once again, pulled herself still higher. More often than that, her feet skittered around, helplessly at first. 2 or 3 efforts let her find rough spots for the boot soles to catch on. The slab's angle was sufficiently gradual that she could get by with risky footholds. Somehow she kept going. Danielle proceeded by exerting most of her weight on the hammers. Sometimes she felt the claws slipping, and once or twice she almost lost control. Yet she managed to keep her grip anyway. She pulled herself upward a few inches at a time, panting, gasping, and fighting the fatigue that left her close to passing out. Danielle managed to fumble up the trench all the way to the top. And it was Jake's turn. Danielle didn't even stop to rest. She tied a length of Flash's nylon leash onto one of the 2 hammers and lowered it to Jake. After Jake untied it, Danielle pulled up the leash, tied on the second hammer, and lowered it as well. Then she assumed the belay position, told Jake what to do, and coaxed him all the way up. The snowstorm had eased again. Snow still sifted down from above, but so much more thinly that it might as well have stopped altogether. Danielle could see the snow-covered rocks around them, the clouds massing around the mountain, and even some of the land visible below the clouds. She could see that they were on a mountain. She could also see the contours of that particular peak. But where she expected to see the cliff above her, she saw only a low mound of snow granite rising off to the left. Mount Remington didn't keep going higher, higher, and higher. On the contrary, it seemed to be leveling off. Danielle felt the angle of the slope underfoot starting to ease. The mountain felt less and less steep. With each step, the ground seemed more nearly level. Soon Danielle and Jake couldn't even keep going on all fours. They had to stand upright. Thick mist streaked around them, so they couldn't see much of the terrain. But within a few minutes, they weren't climbing at all. They were just walking over an uneven but relatively flat surface. Danielle, said Jake, badly winded. Danielle! He stopped, leaned over, coughed, then stood upright again, heaving for breath. I think this is the top, Danielle exclaimed. She wanted to say more, but couldn't. She wanted to shout, to scream for joy, to thank her brother for teaming up to do what they'd done, but she couldn't. She could scarcely breathe, much less talk. All she could say was, the top. The snowfall had stopped. Great clouds massed below them, around them, almost everywhere but above them. They were so high up now that the only vistas Danielle could remember like this were what she'd seen from airplanes. Danielle suddenly understood what people meant by a breathtaking view. Then abruptly, she didn't care about the view at all. She didn't care if it was beautiful or ugly. She started looking around in a different, almost desperate way. Something was wrong. Something about the view. Something wasn't what she saw, but was what she didn't see. There was no weather station in sight. Together, Jake and Danielle worked their way over the jumble of rocks. They walked about 15 or 20 feet ahead to where the flat place they'd reached began curving downward again. Clouds swept all around them. They couldn't see very far, perhaps a few dozen yards down the mountain, But that was just the problem. They were looking down the mountain's far side. Danielle turned, took 20 paces to the right, then turned again and worked her way to Jake's left. She peered over the edge and saw nothing but rock and snow vanishing into the clouds below. The sight chilled her more than the wind needling at her. Danielle watched her brother doing what she herself had just finished doing, except that Jake went farther and peered still more intently over the edge. They must have missed something, she told herself. They hadn't looked hard enough. Yet, she couldn't see anything like what they were looking for. There was nothing at all like a weather station. They were at the summit, alone. "We're dead," Danielle moaned. "Jake, we're dead." Jake stumbled over to her. He had begun to shake and now shook so hard he couldn't stop. He couldn't believe all their efforts had come to this. He couldn't believe his plan hadn't worked. There was supposed to be a weather station up here. He'd seen it on TV. It had to be here. Yet the place around them looked as desolate as the moon. So Jake stood staring at his sister, at how miserable she looked with her gloved hands up against her mouth while she cried, and he felt hollow and terrible inside. "Danielle," he said, "I'm sorry." A moment later he started crying too. He reached out to embrace her. They held each other a long time. He wanted to reassure Danielle, to suggest a new idea that would save them after all, but he couldn't think of anything. All he could think about was the cold. What would it feel like freezing to death? How long would it take? Would it be peaceful, as some people said it was? Peaceful? What a joke! How could it be peaceful? Even if Jake went numb and didn't feel the pain of his fingers and toes turning to ice, of his blood thickening to slush, then surely he'd still think every last second about how he'd let down Mom, Dad, and Danielle. She was pushing him away. That push hurt worst of all, and tears filled Jake's eyes so fast that his vision went blurry. "This is your fault," she screamed. "Danielle, I'm sorry." "Your fault. Listen. You and your stupid weather station." "Danielle, listen." She took him by the shoulders and shook him. "I'm sorry," Jake shouted back. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." She shook him harder and harder. She shook him so hard that Danielle almost knocked him over. But then gradually, at first, the way she shook him started to change. She wasn't pushing him now. She was trying to get his attention. Puzzled at first, Jake soon understood what his sister was doing. He pulled back from her. He wiped his eyes with the back of his gloves. "Look," she cried, "just look." Danielle was pointing into the clouds, sweeping past from left to right. "What is it?" "Over there." Jake leaned this way and that to get a better look. At first, all he saw was the soft, gray-white nothingness of the clouds. Then, looking more closely, he realized that what he saw wasn't just the clouds. It was also the clouds shifting, parting, and revealing something beyond. First, just textures, then shapes, some sort of low horizontal box, some vertical lines. He couldn't tell what it was. Something inside the clouds. At that moment, the clouds shifted, and whatever he'd been seeing took on more detail. Walls, windows, a metal roof, some sort of shed next to the main structure, a big antenna poking up from the shed, a satellite dish mounted on the roof. The longer he looked, the more he saw, and he saw something else too, a stony ridge that connected Danielle and Jake's summit to another summit, a pile of massive boulders topped by those ghostly buildings. The weather station, Jake exclaimed. We're on a false summit, Danielle said. That's the real summit over there. Without another word, they rushed over to the edge and scrambled as fast as possible. Without tumbling headfirst, they climbed down toward the ridge, connecting where they were to where they wanted to be. Danielle was shaken hard by the time she and Jake worked their way over to the weather station. Her hands shook, her knees shook, her whole body shook. She was shaken from excitement, but mostly from the cold. Danielle couldn't remember having ever felt so cold. She almost felt as if she were bleeding to death, except that her blood was heat, and all that heat was leaking from her body. In a few minutes, the heat would be gone. Danielle and Jake staggered the last few feet up the slope to the weather station. Drifts lay piled on the fair side of the buildings, drifts so deep that Danielle had to wallow to get anywhere. She lost her balance several times trying to push through. Twice she fell over and ended up with a face full of snow. Yet somehow she managed, and Jake did too, and they made it all the way to the biggest of the buildings. Where's the door? Danielle asked. Maybe this way, Jake answered, and they worked their way around. They worked their way around to the right. Danielle started pounding on the door the moment she reached it. Her hands felt so dumb, however, she couldn't even make a fist. She couldn't even make a fist. She wasn't really pounding, she was slapping. Then Jake started in, too, striking the door as hard as he could. They both stopped and fell silent. All they heard was the whistle of the wind and the fluttering noise it made against the weather station. Maybe nobody's home, Jake said. Don't be ridiculous, Danielle told him. But his words chilled her even more than the cold. What, was it possible? Could they have come all the way here only to reach a vacant building? She glanced around. There was a relatively flat, open area right next to the building, the sort of area someone might use to park a truck up here, but no truck in sight. Danielle saw no vehicles at all. On the other side of this area, though, was a shed-like structure, and she decided that must be a garage, but she didn't really care. She knew someone was up here. Someone had to be up here. Danielle started pounding again. Jake interrupted her. Listen. She held off. She waited. Just then she heard something. Music, Danielle exclaimed. Some kind of jazz. At once she went back to pounding. Open, she yelled. Open, please. We need help. Jake pounded too. Then they stopped, waited, listened. Nothing happened. Danielle could feel her excitement vanish in a moment's time. Surely they wouldn't climb all day only to discover that no one could hear them. Before she could start pounding again, though, Jake said, Wait, maybe the music's too loud. He took off his pack, pulled it open, and rummaged around inside. When he couldn't find what he wanted, he dumped everything out into the snow. What are you doing? Danielle asked. Jake picked up Dad's biggest hammer, he said, improvising. At once he started banging on the door, banging so hard that each blow dented the metal. The music stopped a few moments later. Danielle could almost imagine that she heard a voice. Then Jake said, Okay, get ready. Ready? Danielle asked, unsure of what he meant. Watching, she saw Jake reach down to his empty pack. Just then, Danielle saw what he was going to do, but she understood too late to stop him. As the door swung open, revealing two startled men on the other side, Jake held out his empty pack like a Halloween bag. Trick or treat.